everyone, this is Pat Camillo again, back. This section called Estrogen in the Brain will give you sort of an overview of a little bit of the physiology without getting crazy into physiology, because that's not the objective of this program at all, although I do like to dabble in it. But you have to understand a little bit in order to understand the real meat of the program. Okay, so what I'm going to cover in this section are the following 5 topics. We're going to look at the male and female brain a little bit of Mars, Venus. We're going to look at estrogen production in the brain. And yes, estrogen is produced in the brain, not just the ovaries. We're also going to look at estrogens and their relationship with neurotransmitters, and how those neurotransmitters work involves something we call estrogen receptors, and we have lots of those in the brain. And then finally, I'm going to share something that personally I just learned recently that was surprising, but actually has been in the literature. I've just never come across it. And that is that estrogen actually has a circadian rhythm. So without further ado, we're going to start covering these areas. All right. So first of all, we were all female right from the very beginning in utero. Estrogen is actually the default brain. The estrogen dominant brain is the default brain when a fetus is developing in the uterus. So in order for a male to become a male brain, it needs estrogen. If testosterone doesn't come into play, it stays female. But once testosterone is introduced, it becomes male. So clearly both men and women really depend on estrogen for a healthy, functioning brain, even though there are lots of really big differences in the way each of these brains is organized. And that's not just between genders, but also between, or it's not just between sexes, but also between genders and also between individuals within each gender. And I like to highlight this whenever I have the opportunity, because we get so stuck in a real algorithmic culture where we're almost treating everyone like they are exactly the same. But we are so not. We are all so biochemically individual and so much so in terms of hormonal differences. We are all hormonally unique as well. So it's something to always keep in mind. There isn't an everyone scenario here. We're very unique in a lot of ways. So now you might be wondering, where on earth does the male brain get its estrogen? But I'm going to tell you. So take a look at this graphic. It's not my favorite, but I have absolutely no artistic ability, so this is the best I can do. What it is showing is that circulating testosterone in males is metabolized into estrogen, and it does that by using an enzyme called aromatase. So you'll see in the graphic on the right that it also, testosterone certainly does connect up with androgen receptors in the brain. But there are actually a lot fewer of these androgen receptors in the developing brain than there are estrogen receptors. And in fact, since men have more testosterone floating around in their body, eventually as they grow and mature, they actually end up with more estrogen in their brain than females. This could be part of the reason why men seem to have some protection, some level of protection against so many of the mental health problems and diseases that women experience. And not to leave women out of the mix, the same process occurs in all of us. The ovaries happen to be a rich source of aromatase, and it's also present in fat. And this is why women who are overweight are at higher risk for breast and uterine cancer. They're producing way too much estrogen, especially after menopause, when their bodies are not geared for that amount of potent estrogen. So aromatase is very important in our bodies, in men's bodies, and certainly in the brain. Another thing to think about that comes to mind, it did for me when I was preparing this, are women who are using aromatase inhibitors. They're really good at reducing the production of estrogen, especially in women with breast cancers, especially those cancers that feed on estrogen. But unfortunately, these enzymes also have a negative effect on the brain when they are being restricted. Because remember, it's that enzyme, it's aromatase, that helps break down testosterone and give all of us, men and women, the estrogen that our brains need. So when we don't have access to aromatase, it has a very negative effect in the brain. Women who use aromatase inhibitors, not uncommonly, end up complaining a lot about brain fog and cognitive difficulty because, again, the aromatase is not allowed to metabolize the androgens in the brain into estrogen. There are some interesting studies now that are showing that exercise can help mitigate the negative effect of these aromatase inhibitors on cognition. Exercise both during the time of receiving these drugs and afterwards appears to hold the key in maintaining normal cognitive function in these women. So we don't really know why exercise is working for some and not for others, but hopefully research will get to the bottom of it. Okay, moving on. Estrogen is in fact made in the brain. And I think we have to understand better that when we talk about estrogen, we're not just talking about the ovaries, because we have estrogen receptors all over our body: brain, ovaries, reproductive tract, skin, bones. So estrogen is really powerful. And in the brain, it's especially so. So apart from being a target for sex hormones, the brain is now recognized as a steroidogenic organ. Now, what does this mean? It means it can produce steroids. And estrogen, of course, is a steroid hormone. So what we have here is what they're calling neurosteroidogenesis, or the synthesis of neuroactive steroids in the brain. Really interesting research shows that even after ovaries have been removed from mice, they found estrogen being produced in the brain. So we're talking about in the absence of ovarian production, independent of ovarian production. The current thinking is that fluctuations in the plasma levels of estrogen affect the rate of brain synthesis of estrogen. So when plasma levels are low, brain synthesis is encouraged and to ramp up. With further research on mice, they also found that the risk for developing Alzheimer's disease was higher when the brain-derived estrogen was depleted. And that was more so than when there was a drop in peripheral blood levels of estrogen. So I know many, many women I've cared for over the years are all wanting to see what their blood level of estrogen is, and it seems the notion is that that's so very important. But we really don't know what's going on in terms of the brain's level of estrogen when you're looking at plasma estrogen. So it may not be all that valuable information than what a lot of women think it is. So a lot of the research I'm going to mention throughout the program uses mice and rats. This is a lot of bench research, which is why, again, many of us have, or many of you have not heard of it. I dabble a lot in it, so I'm able to hopefully bring you some of that. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, mice are great models for this kind of research because they can actually mimic an entire human lifespan in a few weeks. And their estrogen cycles are a great match for human females. Sounds crazy, right? The next time you see a mouse, you may want to, give them a nod. So remember I mentioned that brain estrogen is derived from testosterone, okay, through the action of aromatase. If they could find a way to target some of these key enzymes like aromatase, they might be able to tweak brain estrogen production and possibly even impact the incidence of Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's. So, but that's all to come in the future, hopefully with some good research. So here I want to just give you a quick overview of the neurotransmitters I'll be mentioning throughout the program. Dopamine, huge. It's a big player here. It's involved in motivation, procrastination, but also in terms of delusional thinking. Serotonin, most of you, I would imagine, are somewhat familiar with it. It's implicated in depression for sure, but how many of you knew that it's also involved in hallucinations? So both dopamine and serotonin are modulated by estrogen. And it's the cholinergic system that deals with cognition a lot, plays a large role in memory. And that's enhanced by estrogen. So we'll talk more specifically about this moving forward. Now, this graphic, okay, is, I think, interesting and important because you have these neurotransmitters and you've heard of them before and you heard of all of that, but do you actually know how they get their job done? And it's not as if they're just floating around the system and it works. They create signals between nerve cells. So they're acting like chemical messengers in the same way that the endocrine system uses hormones. And that's how they get things done. But that still doesn't really explain their relationship with estrogen. So if you look closely at the graphic, you'll see estrogen receptors. And that's the key that unlocks the impact. When estrogen is just floating around the body, it doesn't really do anything or have any impact. It's only when estrogen molecules hook up with an estrogen receptor that an effect is produced. So, let's take a look now at some of these estrogen receptors. First of all, they've been around a really long time. They can be traced back 450 million years ago. And in fact, they've been found even in single-celled organisms. So estrogen receptor alpha is the original estrogen receptor to be cloned and characterized. And it's long been associated and connected with regulating reproductive physiology and behaviors. Estrogen receptor beta came along a little bit later. And as we progress through the program, you'll learn that ER beta plays a very significant and positive role in the brain. So really what the effect that estrogen is going to have is dependent on which estrogen receptor it hooks up with. Some may produce a very positive effect, some less so. And it also depends on where that hookup takes place in the body. So, and we know this from SERMs that we've used like tamoxifen. Positive effect in terms of preventing breast cancer, but negative effect in terms of increasing risk for uterine cancer. There's also a few other estrogen receptors newly discovered. One of them is called GPR30, and that is actually located on the membrane of the cell, whereas estrogen receptor alpha and beta are located in the nucleus of the cell. And there are a few other ones, but we're not going to go there. They're so brand new. They're still trying to figure out what they are. But that just gives you an indication of that we're just really beginning to understand the impact of all of this. So I love this graphic because it highlights just how extensive these estrogen receptors are in the brain and what kinds of things they're involved in. So if you look starting at the upper left, you look at the prefrontal cortex, you're seeing learning and memory, and all three of those estrogen receptors are located there, meaning they're going to have an impact on learning and memory. Below that, you will see the hypothalamus, and it regulates temperature, sleep, energy, balance, food intake, and again, all three of those estrogen receptors are involved in those activities and behaviors. Below that, you look at the amygdala, you'll find both estrogen receptor alpha and beta involved in emotion and motivation. And then below that, the serotonergic system is involved in affect and mood, and that also involves both estrogen receptor alpha and beta. And then below that is the adrenergic system, which also includes those two, that involves attention, arousal, and anxiety. And finally, looking at the hippocampus, you have all three of those receptors dealing with information processing and short-term memory. So everything listed here is impacted by estrogen. When there isn't enough estrogen on board or there isn't enough being produced in the brain, then these are the areas that are impacted. Pretty impressive, wouldn't you think? Okay, and just to emphasize this a little bit more, it's another graphic of estrogen signaling in the brain, and it really underscores the importance of estrogen receptors in producing the estrogen effect. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, estrogen receptor beta plays a very important, they believe, neuroprotective role. And although all three of the receptors, as you saw, are active in the brain. Now, if you look at the top right of the slide, you'll see raloxifene, and you might be wondering, well, what is that doing here? So raloxifene, like tamoxifen, is a SERM, and it's basically a module that mimics the action of estrogen in some, but not all ways. But it can be very useful in managing certain brain diseases, such as schizophrenia, without having the negative consequences of getting estrogen sort of straight up. But I'll talk about this a lot more later when I talk about schizophrenia. All right, these last two slides have some fun information that could be very useful for all of us in our daily lives. I bet you've never made the connection between estrogen and procrastination or motivation. It appears that the tendency to procrastinate might be found in our genes, and it appears to be more common in women. One of these genes creates an enzyme called tyrosine hydroxylase. That enzyme happens to be regulated by estrogen. When there's enough estrogen on board, there's a sufficient amount of this enzyme that helps to regulate dopamine. And it's an important neurotransmitter involved in things like attention and memory, decision making, motivation. But when estrogen levels run low, there is less of this enzyme. And so women end up with less dopamine effect. Now, think about the times, certainly in a menstrual cycle, when estrogen runs low, or maybe even postpartum. One of the more classic examples that's often used in the literature is women's desire or motivation for sex. And it's often correlated with certain times in her menstrual cycle. So as estrogen levels increase, a woman's motivation for sex also increases, probably because estrogen is working her dopamine. After she ovulates and estrogen levels start to decline, she's a little less motivated, okay, because that enzyme is not as active and dopamine will be running lower. I had an interesting experience just the other day related to women and decision making. I was in a wine store. I needed a port wine to make a special recipe. And of course, I know nothing about port wines, but thankfully there was a woman in the store who was an expert. So we chatted and she gave me all kinds of good information, but I still couldn't just pick one. That may be because I'm postmenopausal, maybe because my estrogen runs a little low. These kinds of decisions are not easy for me. So I said to her, which one would you pick? And she was back and forth and just couldn't decide. But then as we're standing there talking, this guy is passing by us who also works in the store. And she calls out to him and explains what I'm looking for and says, what do you think? And without hesitation, he said, oh, that one, of course, without a doubt. It was so dramatic. And I just happened to be producing this program. And I thought to myself, wow, that's a great example of, the whole Mars-Venus thing and how we are so dramatically different because of our physiology. So, of course, there are so many factors that come into play when considering all these behaviors, motivation, procrastination, or even any of the other behaviors that I've talked about so far. It's rarely, if ever, just one factor involved. But clearly, estrogen is a player in this field, and more evidence of the power it yields is found especially in our brain. Now, one last thought before I close here. The graphic I used for this post comes from an interesting blog called liberationist.org. And the post was titled, How to Win the Emotional Battle of Procrastination. It was an interesting read because the one phrase that stood out to me was manage your emotions, not your time. We tend to be pretty focused on time management. We talk about it, we teach it, that's really the thing that we think is going to help procrastination. But maybe we're missing the boat. Maybe what's more important is managing emotions, and then our time will be managed better. So a very interesting read if you have a chance. But if you're looking for something a little bit more pragmatic and you're into the managing your time business, an interesting website called procrastination.com will give you that pragmatic approach. So that concludes this section, and I will close now, and when you are ready, you can move on to the next.